Well, there's lots of talk about whether or not President Trump can nominate a replacement Supreme Court justice before the end of his term. Our Verify team digs into it.
There are a lot of questions right now on social media about what happens to Justice Ginsburg's seat on the Supreme Court. So let's sort through what's true and what's false. Our sources for this are the Constitution, the constitutional law expert Kim Whaley, and John Fortier, Director of Governmental Studies at the Bipartisan Policy Center. First up, can President Trump nominate a replacement before the end of his term? We can verify yes. According to Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, only the president has the authority to appoint a Supreme Court justice. Our sources tell us that the Constitution does not have a timeline for nominating a new justice.
An average Supreme Court nomination often takes about 70 days to get it through committee and to the floor. And that certainly puts us late in the year, but there is enough time to get a Supreme Court nomination through in 2020.
Is it likely the Senate will confirm the president's nominee? We can verify yes. Leader Mitch McConnell released a statement shortly after the news of Ginsburg's passing, saying President Trump's nominee will receive a vote on the floor of the United States Senate.
The Senate Majority Leader, pursuant to internal, longstanding Senate rules, basically functions as a veto or as a pass-through.
Is there a precedent for confirming a Supreme Court justice this close to an election?
Obviously, most recently, Republicans refused to confirm a Obama appointee after the death of Justice Scalia. And there have been a couple of other cases like that later in the term. The difference being that the Senate was controlled, of course, by the opposite party.
Trump stated he'll put forth specifically a female nominee in the coming week to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Justice Ginsburg.